Mike McDermott. The last two campaigns of the War of 1812 were both British offensive operations that were stymied. In the first case, after taking Washington, D.C. and burning the White House and several other federal buildings, the British attempted to take Baltimore, first by land, where they were stymied, and then they shelled the fort protecting Baltimore from the sea before departing for the Gulf of Mexico. And there they attempted to seize New Orleans against a failed operation. And now I'd like to detail the first of these campaigns. After occupying Washington for a very short period of time, the British turned to Baltimore, 40 miles to the northeast. The British Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Cochrane, agreed that seizing the city would strike a serious blow to American commerce as well as further damage the United States politically, and of course he was correct. He ordered a land and sea attack, and on 12 September, General Ross disembarked with 5,000 troops at North Point to begin a 14-mile approach to the city of Baltimore. After watching the Washington fiasco unfold, Baltimore's Commerce of Vigilance and Safety drafted every male between 16 and 60 years old to serve. The more elderly men, who were able to carry a flintlock and willing to render a last service to their country and posterity, were enrolled in their own elderly company. General Samuel Smith was in charge of the city's defenses, and he supervised expanding an already elaborate system of earthworks with the 9,000 men who had been provided. The British advance met its first resistance on 12 September when General Ross was killed by a sharpshooter. Attacking the Americans' main defensive position, the British took heavy losses while pushing back the first two line of American defenders. Late in the day, a third and more heavily defended line stalled the British offense. Leaving their campfires burning, the British returned to their ships on 14 September. In the meantime, Fort McHenry, constructed on Locust Point Peninsula guarding the entrance to Baltimore Harbor, was under attack by the British fleet. The British attack on Fort McHenry was limited, however, to a naval bombardment that started early on the morning of 13 September. Shallow water plus a barrier of 22 ships that the Americans had sunk in the channel forced the Royal Navy's deep water fleet to stand off. And the attack was conducted by 4 mortar catches and a rocket ship from a range of 4,000 yards, outside the range of the American cannon. So the Americans could not respond effectively. Damage to the fort was minimal, however, and after 25 hours of continuous firing, the ships ran low on ammunition. The British Army had suffered about 400 casualties during their combat with the local militia, who reported they had 4 men killed and 24 wounded. 4 other American soldiers were killed in the fort. A serious disaster had been averted, however, when a British shell crashed into the fort's powder magazine but failed to explode. Major Armstead was one of 5 brothers who served during the War of 1812. He distinguished himself at the capture of Fort George on the Niagara River on the 27th of May, 1813, and was detailed to carry captured British flags to Washington. After reporting to the Secretary of War, he was put in command of Fort McHenry. Once there, he ordered, quote, a flag so large that the British would have no difficulty seeing it from a distance, end quote. The flag, measuring 42 by 30 feet, was made by Baltimore resident Mary Pickergill, her daughter, and 7 other seamstresses. That Star-Spangled Banner did attract British attention during the bombardment, and it also inspired a poem that was initially popular but eventually became famous. The flag is now on permanent display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. A nephew, Confederate General Lewis Armstead, was wounded and captured on the 3rd of July, 1863, while leading an assault on the Union line at Gettysburg, and died 3 days later in a Union field hospital. Francis Scott Key, a Washington lawyer attempting to negotiate the release of the American Dr. William Beans, a civilian prisoner of war, witnessed the bombardment of Fort McHenry from a nearby truce ship. When he saw the stars and stripes still flying after a night's gunfire, he composed a poem entitled Defense of Fort McHenry, which was later set to a popular tune of the day. The composition was later renamed the Star-Spangled Banner and became our national anthem on the 3rd of March, 1933. The first stanza of the poem captures the nation's spirit. With a range of 19 semitones, it is a difficult song to sing, and I will not attempt to sing it. However, I would like to recite the words. Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? And so ended the assault on Fort McHenry. We'll now take a look at the final action of the war at New Orleans. The British had considered attacking the Gulf Coast to relieve pressure on Canada as early as 1812, the first year of the war. And capturing New Orleans eventually became the focus of their strategy in the Gulf region. Their purpose was to close commerce on the Mississippi River and use the city of New Orleans as a future bargaining chip while they negotiated the end of the war. Toward that end, the British commander, General Edward Pakenham, who was the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law, received secret instructions from the Secretary of State for War and the colonies, which read in part, quote, "You may possibly hear, while engaged in active operations, that the preliminaries of peace between His Majesty and the United States have been signed in Europe, and that they have been sent to America in order to receive the ratification of the American government. As the treaty will not be binding until it has received that ratification, it's advisable that hostilities should not be suspended until you shall have official information that the President has actually signed the treaty, and a person will be duly authorized to appraise you of that event," end quote. The British Army that had burned Washington and been turned back at Baltimore was then withdrawn to the West Indies to reorganize and receive reinforcements for the attack on New Orleans. In early December 1814, a British fleet of 60 ships with 14,450 soldiers and sailors aboard anchored in the Gulf of Mexico to the east of Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Burgoyne. Unwilling to hazard the fleet to the 80 miles of twisting Mississippi River, the enemy chose to approach New Orleans using Lake Burgoyne. On 14 December, they were confronted on the lake by a flotilla of 5 American gunboats commanded by Lieutenant Casby Jones. A British force of 1,200 sailors and Marines in 42 longboats overwhelmed and captured those Americans, allowing their army to cross the lake, allowing the British Army, that is, to cross the lake and establish a camp about 30 miles east of the city of New Orleans. On 23 December, 1,800 British soldiers reached the east bank of the Mississippi River 9 miles from New Orleans. That night, American General Andrew Jackson, leading 2,100 men, attacked the unprepared British, who suffered 277 casualties in the confusion of an unexpected night attack. The Americans had 213 men killed or wounded before they withdrew to the Rodriguez Canal, some 4 miles south of New Orleans. The British didn't move against the Americans for another 3 days. The delay gave General Jackson additional time to turn that canal, which stretched about 1,000 yards from a swamp to the banks of the Mississippi River, into a formidable defensive earthworks. The British Army took up positions before the fortifications on New Year's Day, 1815, and began an artillery bombardment to reduce those defenses. The British then conducted a two-pronged attack early on the 8th of January. 780 British soldiers crossed the Mississippi River and captured a 20-gun battery that had been established by General Jackson, while the main force of 5,800 British soldiers assaulted the Americans' earthworks, which were defended by about 4,300 men and 8 batteries of heavy cannon. So the British conducted 2 attacks, one on each side of the Mississippi River simultaneously. The idea of taking that 20-gun battery was to then turn those American cannon on the American defenses on the other side of the river. The British conducted 3 assaults against the Americans who were entrenched in the Rodriguez Canal, and in less than an hour suffered approximately 700 men killed, including their commander, General Pakenham, and they had an additional 1,400 men wounded. After the shooting stopped, about 500 British soldiers who had pretended to be dead in the field in front of the Rodriguez Canal stood up and surrendered. Several of the enemy, who in the dark and confusion had taken shelter in the canal itself, immediately under the defenders' guns, also revealed themselves and surrendered. The Americans reported 31 men killed, another 30 wounded, and 19 missing. The British troops who crossed the Mississippi River had no effect on the battle, as they were recalled when the main attack ended. And the British Army began a slow retreat and returned to the fleet on the 10th of January. The Royal Navy wrote a final chapter in the battle by shelling Fort St. Philip, which protected New Orleans from a river assault. They bombarded the fort for 9 days without effect before re-entering the Gulf of Mexico. And a month later, they captured Fort Bauer at the mouth of Mobile Bay, Alabama, but then canceled their attack on Mobile itself, abandoned Fort Bauer, and sailed to their base in the West Indies when word arrived that the Treaty of Ghent, ending the war, had gone into effect the previous December. An unknown American rifleman provided the following account of his experience on the firing line. Colonel Smiley from Bardstown, Kentucky, was the first one to give us orders to fire from our part of the line. And then I reckon there was a pretty considerable noise. Directly after the firing began, Captain Parkinson, I think he was also from Kentucky, but an Irishman born, came running along. He jumped upon the breastwork and, stooping a moment to look through the darkness as well as he could, he shouted with a broad Irish brogue, "Shoot low, boys, shoot low. Rake 'em, rake 'em. They're coming on their all fours." He could see British troops crawling on the plain right in front of their defenses. That American rifleman continued. After the first shot, everyone loaded and banged away on his own hook. Henry Spillman did not load and fire quite so often as some of the rest. But every time he did fire, he would go up to the breastwork, look over until he could see something specific to shoot at, and take deliberate aim and crack away. A British officer, Colonel Harry Smith, recounted how he was sent under a flag of truce with a letter for General Jackson requesting that the British be allowed to recover their wounded and also bury their dead. General Jackson provided a positive response, and Colonel Smith then met the American Adjutant General, Colonel Butler, to coordinate his mission. According to Colonel Smith's account, the American officer was carrying a drawn sword. When asked why, he responded, "Because I reckon a scabbard is no use as long as one of you Britishers is on our soil." The American colonel then commented on the number of wounded in the field. And Colonel Smith said, quote, "Why, this is nothing to us Wellington fellows. The next brush we have with you, you will see how a brigade of the Peninsular Army will serve you out with the bayonet." The Americans' response captured the essence of the whole situation. "Well," said Colonel Butler, "I calculate you must get at us first." And now just a few words concerning the timing of these actions and the Treaty of Ghent. It's very interesting that conventional history says that the fight took place well after the treaty had been signed, and that's true. However, that treaty was not ratified until the 17th of February. In other words, the initial instructions given to the British commander by the British Secretary of War in the colonies that he should not pay any attention to negotiations or to rumors that a treaty had been signed, that he should continue operations until he received British word that the treaty had been ratified by the Americans, was absolutely spot on. The Treaty of Ghent was actually signed by the American and British delegates on the 24th of December, 1814. On the 8th of January, some 2 weeks later, the British attacked New Orleans. And the following month, on the 12th of February, they took Fort Bowen on Mobile Bay. But the fact is, it was another 5 days before the Senate ratified that treaty and the president signed and officially brought the war to an end. So while the treaty had been negotiated before the attack on New Orleans, in fact, it had not been ratified until the 17th of February, 5 weeks after the British attempted to take New Orleans. And thus ends the final campaign of the War of 1812. Now, don't hesitate to comment concerning these campaigns and how I am approaching this history of the United States Army. Until then, God bless each and every one of us, and God bless America.